The Soviets had picked up on NATO maneuvers, looking at what Reagan was doing. And keep in mind, when Reagan became president, he increased the U.S. military budget by 10%. This was double what people thought he could do. Reagan was intent on rebuilding not just our military, but also our intelligence capability, both of which had been hollowed out during the Carter presidency. The Soviets saw this, and they read an offensive intent into Reagan's actions. And in 1983, the Soviets came up with something called Operation Ryan. Ryan is an acronym standing for nuclear war in the Russian language. And the Soviets were concerned that NATO was preparing a first strike nuclear launch. It takes a period of time, but word of the Soviet perception does get back to Reagan. And in his own memoirs, the president says that he was surprised that the Soviets were as afraid as they were during the 1983 war scare. It leads him to a subtle enough change in his thinking that he's going to be ready for a man the likes of Gorbachev to come on scene. Also, let's keep in mind that when Gorbachev becomes General Secretary in 1985, the Soviets had been through a disastrous encounter in Afghanistan. We were having our problems in Nicaragua and Central America, El Salvador. Those wars by proxy had damaged both the Soviet Union and the United States, physically, militarily, but also in terms of world opinion. So here we have Reagan, who had been president for 5 years. Gorbachev comes on the scene in March of 1985. And Reagan's most trusted confidant, Margaret Thatcher, meets with Gorbachev and says, "This is a man we can do business with." That is an incredibly important testament, if you will, that Margaret Thatcher has vouched for the bona fides of Gorbachev. Not saying we're going to accept everything he says out of hand, but the idea that this is not the same old rumpled suit with the thick neck, with the very bad offensive manners that we had seen in previous Soviet leaders. Gorbachev's going to be different. And as proof of it, he writes a book called Perestroika, New Thinking for Our Country and the World. And what's notable, this New York Times bestseller is first published outside the Soviet Union. The Soviet people do not have a look at the thinking of their leader. The first look goes to the outside. It goes to the West. And we have to ask the question, why? Why does Gorbachev's book get printed outside the Soviet Union? Why is it written for the rest of the world? Why isn't this directed at the Soviet people? And it speaks to the nature of what the Soviet Union had become by the time Gorbachev is elected General Secretary. Remember, Gorbachev represented the new age, but he was very much a creation of the KGB. And as the Mitrokhin book made clear, the KGB, to a large extent, directed the foreign policy of the Soviet Union throughout the Brezhnev years, up to and including Gorbachev's time. To what end? And the danger that the KGB accurately saw was that the Soviet Union was a sick state. Tremendous nuclear arms, tremendous conventional military, but a horribly weak economic belly. The truth that Gorbachev finds out in March of '85 when he becomes General Secretary is that the Soviet Union is a unidimensional superpower. And because of its economic weakness, if they can't fix that problem, then in the future the Soviet Union will not be able to retain its superpower status. Now there's something to keep in mind, because we'll get back to this in a little bit. What is the quality of economics that the Soviets so much need to emulate as compared to the West? It has to do with two things: financing, but more specifically, technology. Technology is the key to the West's military strength, to the West's economic strength. The Soviets had been stealing technology for years. And there is another piece of Cold War history that has come out over the last decade or so, is being more fully developed. And it has to do with something called the Farewell Dossier. Farewell Dossier is very well written up by William Safire in a piece he had done in the New York Times. And if you Google Farewell Dossier, William Safire, New York Times, you'll have it.